After 3 years caring for my paralyzed husband, I overheard him call me his servant. So I stopped. Have you ever given your whole life to someone you loved, only to discover they never truly appreciated your sacrifice? Please stay with me as I tell you my story, and don't forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones. My name is Ren, and this story begins 7 days before I walked away from my marriage forever. 3 years earlier, my husband, Blaine, was a hardworking electrician with endless energy and big dreams for our future. Everything changed after a devastating highway accident left him paralyzed from the waist down. In a single moment, the life we had carefully built disappeared. Before the accident, I worked as a physical therapist and loved helping people recover from injuries. When Blaine came home from the hospital, I didn't hesitate. I left my career because I believed my place was beside my husband during the most difficult time of his life. I told myself that love wasn't only about celebrating happy moments. It was also about carrying each other through pain. The days became months, and the months became 3 long years. My entire routine centered on Blaine's care. I managed his therapy, medications, appointments, meals, and every challenge that came with his condition. Slowly, my own dreams faded into the background. My friendships grew distant, my health suffered, and the woman I used to be seemed to disappear. Even then, I never questioned my decision. I believed every sacrifice was worth making for the person I loved. I kept hoping that one day things would become easier and that we would rebuild our life together. I never imagined that a single conversation overheard by accident would change everything. And it all began exactly 7 days before I finally chose to walk away forever. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, just as I had every day for the past 3 years. Before I even made myself a cup of coffee, I checked on Blaine, helped him get out of bed, and started preparing everything he would need for the day. His medications had to be taken at specific times, his breakfast had to match the nutrition plan recommended by his doctors, and his physical therapy exercises couldn't be skipped. My own needs always came last. Every hour followed a schedule that I knew by heart. I arranged his medical appointments, spoke with insurance representatives, filled out paperwork, ordered prescriptions, prepared meals, cleaned the house, and handled every unexpected problem that came our way. There was never a real day off. Even during the night, I slept lightly because Blaine often needed help turning over or reaching something beside the bed. The constant lifting and assisting slowly damaged my back. Some mornings, the pain was so sharp that standing upright took several minutes. I never mentioned it because I didn't want Blaine to feel guilty. Instead, I smiled and kept going, convincing myself that tomorrow would be easier. As time passed, my phone became quieter. Friends stopped inviting me to birthdays, dinners, and weekend trips because they already knew my answer. At first they understood, but eventually our conversations became rare. Without realizing it, my world had become limited to doctors' offices, pharmacies, and our home. What hurt even more was the change in Blaine. After the accident, he had thanked me for every little thing. Now those words had disappeared. Instead of asking for help, he expected it. If I took a few extra minutes to bring him something, he became impatient. If dinner wasn't exactly what he wanted, he complained. Gratitude slowly turned into entitlement. So I refused to judge him. I told myself the accident had stolen his independence and that frustration was making him act this way. I believed the man I married was still there beneath the anger, waiting for better days. Late that evening, Blaine reminded me about another hospital appointment scheduled for the following morning. Then he looked at me and said, "You're coming with me, of course. I need you there." I quietly nodded, never imagining that visit would change everything. The next morning, I drove Blaine to the hospital for what I believed would be another routine appointment. The waiting room looked just like every other visit we had made over the past 3 years. Nurses greeted us, patients came and went, and I checked him in before helping him into the rehabilitation area. I had done this so many times that every step felt automatic. After his therapist called him inside, the receptionist asked me to complete a few insurance forms and collect updated paperwork from another office down the hall. I told Blaine I would only be gone for a few minutes. He nodded without even looking up from his phone. As I walked back with the documents, I heard laughter coming from a quiet corner near the hallway. The voice sounded familiar, so I slowed down. It was Blaine. He hadn't noticed me because his wheelchair was turned away from the entrance. He was speaking with someone he had known since college. At first, I smiled because I thought it was good to hear him laughing again. Then I heard words I will never forget. He chuckled and said, "Ren?" She's basically my live-in servant. She does everything for me. The person on the other end must have asked if I ever complained because Blaine laughed even harder. Leave? She'll never leave. She feels too responsible for me. I don't have to worry about that. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My hands tightened around the folder until the papers almost slipped onto the floor. Every early morning, every sleepless night, every sacrifice I had made flashed through my mind. The man I had cared for with my whole heart wasn't speaking with gratitude. He was making jokes at my expense. I stayed completely still, hidden behind the corner, listening as he continued laughing. He sounded proud, almost amused by how certain he was that I would always stay. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't cry. I didn't argue or demand an explanation. I quietly turned around, walked back down the hallway and took a long, steady breath. In that silent moment, something inside me changed forever. From that day forward, I stopped asking myself how to save my marriage and started wondering how to save myself. That evening, after we returned home, the house felt strangely quiet. Blaine went about his usual routine, acting as though nothing important had happened. He never realized I had heard every word of his conversation at the hospital. I prepared dinner, helped him settle into bed, and finished the last few chores without saying anything. My silence wasn't caused by fear. I simply needed time to think. When the house was finally still, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. For the first time in years, I stopped focusing on what Blaine needed and started looking at my own life. I wrote down everything I did in a single day. The list kept growing. Morning care, medications, meals, therapy, exercises, laundry, cleaning, grocery shopping, insurance calls, doctor appointments, prescription refills, bills, transportation, paperwork, and countless small tasks that no one ever noticed. By the time I finished, several pages were filled. As I looked at those pages, a painful truth became impossible to ignore. I wasn't simply supporting Blaine. I had been carrying almost every responsibility in our home by myself. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being his partner and become the person managing his entire world. I opened my old laptop and searched for the resume I hadn't updated since leaving my career as a physical therapist. Reading it reminded me of the woman I used to be. I added the experience and skills I had gained over the past 3 years, saved the new version, and sent it to my former rehabilitation clinic with a short message asking if any positions were available. After pressing send, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. It wasn't excitement. It was hope. Meanwhile, Blaine remained completely unaware of the change taking place. He called for help with small things just as he always had, expecting tomorrow to be no different from yesterday. He believed I would continue answering every request without question. He never imagined that while he was planning another ordinary day, I had quietly begun rebuilding the future I thought I had lost forever. The following morning, I checked my email while Blaine was finishing breakfast. I wasn't expecting an answer so quickly, but there it was. My former rehabilitation clinic had replied. They thanked me for reaching out and invited me to interview later that week. I read the message twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. For the first time in years, someone saw me as more than a caregiver. They remembered me as a skilled physical therapist. I accepted the interview without telling Blaine. It wasn't because I wanted to be dishonest. I simply wasn't ready to explain a decision that I was still quietly building. I knew that if I spoke too soon, he would expect me to change my mind. Later that afternoon, while Blaine watched television, I began researching professional home care agencies. I wanted to make sure he would be safe after I left. I compared licensed caregivers, checked reviews, read about their training, and looked at the services they provided. They could help with personal care, meal preparation, mobility assistance, medication reminders, and transportation to medical appointments. Then I noticed the cost. The weekly rates were far higher than I expected. As I added everything together, I realized that the work I had been doing without pay for 3 years was worth an incredible amount. I wasn't shocked because of the money. I was shocked because I had never allowed myself to recognize the value of my time, my knowledge, and my effort. That realization changed something inside me. My care had never been free. I had paid for it with my career, my health, my independence, and years of my life. From that moment on, every choice became practical instead of emotional. I organized important documents, reviewed my savings, planned a realistic budget, and started preparing for the next chapter. Each small step gave me more confidence. Meanwhile, Blaine continued calling my name whenever he wanted something. A glass of water, the television remote, another pillow, a snack, or help reaching an item only a few feet away. He never paused to wonder whether I was tired or whether I had dreams of my own. In his mind, I existed to serve him. He had no idea that my future was already beginning to take shape without him. 2 days before everything changed, I left the house early and told Blaine I had a few errands to finish before his afternoon therapy session. He barely looked up from his phone. He simply reminded me not to be late because he expected me to drive him later that day. I quietly agreed and walked out the door. When I arrived at the rehabilitation clinic, it felt like stepping into a part of my life I thought was gone forever. The familiar hallways, treatment rooms, and friendly faces reminded me why I had chosen this profession. During the interview, we talked about my experience before I left and everything I had learned while caring for Blaine. The director told me those years hadn't taken me away from healthcare. They had given me even greater compassion and practical knowledge. Before I left the building, they offered me the position. I accepted without hesitation. As I signed the employment papers, I felt a weight slowly lifting from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I was making a decision for my own future instead of giving up another piece of it. My next stop was a small apartment across town. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was clean, peaceful, and affordable. Sunlight filled the living room through wide windows, and I could already imagine coming home after work to a place that belonged entirely to me. I completed the rental agreement, collected the keys, and quietly placed them in my purse. There was still one important responsibility left. I contacted the licensed home care agency I had researched and finalized Blaine's care plan. Together we reviewed his medications, therapy schedule, mobility needs, medical appointments, and daily routine. Experienced caregivers would begin assisting him immediately after my departure. I refused to leave him without support because that wasn't who I was. Everything was arranged with care and respect. Blaine would continue receiving the help he needed, but it would come from trained professionals, not from a wife he had reduced to a servant in his own mind. That evening, I returned home as if nothing had changed. Blaine assumed the next day would follow the same routine as always. He never realized every detail had already been prepared, and that our lives were about to move in completely different directions. One day remained before I would finally leave. I woke with a strange sense of calm. The fear that had filled my heart a few days earlier had been replaced by certainty. I wasn't acting out of anger anymore. I was making a thoughtful decision after years of giving everything I had. After breakfast, I gathered every important document Blaine would need. I organized his medications into clearly labeled containers and created a schedule showing exactly when each one should be taken. I printed copies of his therapy routine, listed upcoming medical appointments, and arranged his insurance papers in a binder. I included emergency phone numbers, contact information for his doctors, pharmacy details, and instructions for anything the caregivers might need to know. Every page was easy to read because I wanted the transition to be smooth. I checked everything twice. If there was even a small chance that something had been overlooked, I corrected it immediately. Leaving didn't mean I wanted Blaine to suffer. Despite everything I had heard, I still cared about his well-being. My decision was about protecting my own dignity, not seeking revenge. The rest of the day passed quietly. Blaine never questioned why I seemed more organized than usual. He accepted every meal, every reminder, and every bit of help as though it were simply expected. Nothing in his behavior suggested he noticed the distance growing between us. That evening, while I was putting the binder into a drawer, I heard him talking on the phone again. His voice carried through the hallway, followed by familiar laughter. Then he said, "If I call Ren, she'll come running. She always does." The words were spoken so casually, as if my devotion were something to joke about. I closed my eyes for a moment. There was no shock this time, only clarity. Hearing him repeat the same disrespect removed every remaining doubt from my mind. The man I had loved no longer understood the difference between kindness and obligation. I quietly finished packing the last few personal belongings into a small suitcase and placed it near the front door. Tomorrow I wouldn't choose guilt. I wouldn't choose fear. For the first time in 3 years, I would choose myself. The morning I decided to leave felt different from every other morning. I woke before the alarm, made a simple breakfast, and set the table just as I had done countless times before. The house was quiet and everything around me looked familiar, yet I knew nothing would ever be the same after that day. I helped Blaine settle into his wheelchair and placed his breakfast in front of him. He thanked me without looking away from the television. It was a normal morning to him. Another day he believed would follow the same routine. He had no idea that every detail had already been arranged. When he finished eating, I carried a large binder to the table and placed it in front of him. "What's this?" he asked. "It has everything you'll need," I replied calmly. "Your medication schedule, therapy plan, insurance information, doctor contacts, emergency numbers, appointment calendar, and instructions for your daily care." He looked confused as he slowly opened the binder. Before he could ask another question, I continued speaking. "I've accepted a position at my former rehabilitation clinic. I also rented an apartment and I'll be moving there today. Licensed caregivers will be here shortly to help you. They're fully informed about your routine and will make sure you're taken care of." For several seconds he simply stared at me, unable to respond. Finally he said, "You're leaving? You can't be serious." "I am serious," I answered gently. "I've spent 3 years giving you everything I had because I loved you. I never expected anything in return except respect." His face changed as he realized I wasn't arguing or making empty threats. I took a slow breath before saying the words I had carried in my heart for days. "A wife is a partner, Blaine. She isn't a servant." Somewhere along the way you stopped seeing the difference. A knock sounded at the front door. The caregivers had arrived exactly on time. I picked up my small suitcase, walked toward the entrance, and opened the door for them. After introducing everyone, I stepped outside without looking back. I didn't leave with anger or bitterness. I left with peace, knowing I had finally chosen a life where my kindness would never again be mistaken for obligation. During the first week after I left, life changed for both of us. The licensed caregivers arrived on time every day and provided exactly the services they had been hired to perform. They helped Blaine with his personal care, therapy, medications, and daily routines, but when their scheduled hours ended, they went home. They didn't stay late to organize forgotten paperwork, spend hours on insurance calls, prepare extra meals, or offer the quiet emotional support that had once filled our home. For the first time, Blaine began to notice the countless responsibilities that had always been handled without being asked. Keeping track of appointments, renewing prescriptions, paying bills on time, answering emails, and solving unexpected problems suddenly required planning and effort. He realized those tasks had never completed themselves. Someone had been carrying them every single day. He called me many times during that first week. Sometimes he left messages asking me to come back. Other times he simply wanted to talk. I answered only once. "I hope you're doing well," I said calmly. "The caregivers have everything they need. I wish you the best, but I'm not coming back." It wasn't spoken with anger. It was simply the truth. While Blaine adjusted to his new reality, I slowly rebuilt mine. I returned to work at the rehabilitation clinic, reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, and finally allowed myself to enjoy simple moments without feeling guilty. Each day reminded me that I still had dreams worth pursuing and a life that belonged to me. Several months later, Blaine asked if we could meet one last time. I agreed. He looked at me with genuine regret and quietly admitted that he had mistaken unconditional love for an obligation. He confessed that he had failed to appreciate everything I had sacrificed and understood his mistakes far too late. I thanked him for his honesty and accepted his apology. Holding on to bitterness would only keep me trapped in the past. But I also told him I could not return to a marriage where I had lost myself trying to save someone else. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in years. Blaine finally understood the difference between having someone serve you and being deeply loved. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for staying with me until the end of my story.